Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in tonight. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan, the Miami Book Fair, and all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Amy Paige Condon to discuss A Nervous Man Shouldn't Be Here in the First Place, The Life of Bill Baggs. I want to give a shout out to Theo Long at the Biscayne Nature Center in Key Biscayne for helping us get the word out about this event, and to Art Yerian, the Bill Baggs Cape Florida park manager, who has arranged to have a barge that shows movies around town come to No Name Harbor and broadcast tonight's discussion. So shout out to everyone who's watching from there. The late editor of the Late Miami News, Bill Baggs, championed unpopular ideas in his front page columns, such as protecting the environment, desegregating public schools, and peace in Vietnam. In this first biography of the influential editor, Amy Condon retraces how an orphaned boy from Georgia bore witness and impacted some of the 20th century's most earth-shifting events. Amy Paige Condon is the founder of the Refinery Writing Studio and the associate editor of Beacon, a quarterly news magazine published by the Savannah Morning News. She's the co-author of Wiley's Championship Barbecue Cookbook and the Back in the Day Bakery Cookbook. In conversation with Amy this evening, we have the great good fortune to be joined by Bill Baggs' son, Craig Baggs, who attended his first national political convention at age 6, and by the age of 11, found himself standing in the Oval Office with his father, being introduced to Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren. We're going to hear many stories from him tonight as he brings a very personal point of view to this conversation. To moderate tonight's talk is Dr. Gregory Bush. Dr. Bush received his PhD in history from Columbia University and was a history professor and director of the Institute for Public History at the University of Miami from 1983 to 2018. He established the Lewis Wolfson Florida Media History Center, was a founder and president of the Urban Environment League, and founded Nature Links for Lifelong Learning, which he now runs in Blue Hill, Maine. Gregory is the co-author with Arva Parks McCabe of Miami, The American Crossroads, and author of Lord of Attention, as well as White Sand, Black Beach, Civil Rights, Public Space, and Miami's Virginia Key Beach, which won several state awards. We'll have some time to take audience questions after the talk, so please go ahead and put in your questions anytime during the broadcast in the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. You can order a copy of A Nervous Man from Books and Books below by pressing the green button at the bottom of the screen. Please be aware that the publication date is October 20th, so we won't be able to ship these out until that date. But we also have copies of Dr. Bush's books available for sale on our website below. Every purchase you make keeps Books and Books up and running, so we thank you. Press the donate button anytime, and any amount is welcome. Indie bookstores need your help now more than ever. So again, thank you for your generosity and your support. And now, without further ado, I'd like to bring our guests to the stage. Here's Amy. Here's Craig. And here is Greg. Hello.
Hi. Thank you so much thank you so much for your warm hospitality, Christina, and to Books and Books. When I lived in Miami, I visited Books and Books, oh goodness, at least once a week for an author event. And the number of signed books I have from there are far too many to count. So this is a bit of a dream fulfilled and a bit of a homecoming for me. To the folks at No Name Harbor there tonight, I wish I were sitting there with you, but in spirit, I have made a gin and tonic cocktail, one of Bill Baggs' favorites. And I salute Theo Long, Art Yerian, Art Levy, the Friends of Bill Baggs Cape Florida State Park, and the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas Biscayne Nature Center for being the champion of Bill's environmental legacy. Cheers. Cheers, cheers to you. You're here. Let this be a celebration. I also want to just sort of reiterate something that Christina mentioned. These organizations, Books and Books, the Park, the Nature Center, they're all deserving of your financial support, and they're what make Miami unique and special. And if you were listening tonight, just consider ways in which you might be able to donate to one of these organizations and buy your books there for Christmas and for gifts and for yourself. Chances are high that if you're a resident or a visitor of Miami, you have seen the tall white lighthouse or stretched out on the sugary sands of Bill Baggs Cape Florida State Park on the southernmost tip of Key Biscayne. Chances are equally high you have no idea who Bill Baggs is or why the park is named for him. I didn't until that fateful day in Miami in July 1993 when I asked, "Who's Bill Baggs?" And I had no idea all the places that answer would lead me. Bill Baggs was the late editor of the Late Miami News and was one of the most impactful local newspaper editors of the 20th century. I hope it changes, that we really learn who he was through this biography. A Nervous Man Shouldn't Be Here in the First Place. Again, it'll be in stores next week because his story truly is one for the ages. And the Miami and Florida we know today was in many ways shaped by his advocacy for civil rights, for social justice, for historic and environmental preservation, and for peace in Vietnam. He started as an aviation reporter for the news in 1946, and after serving as a bombardier during World War II, he soon began covering labor and transportation issues. He then became a lead columnist. And then once he had the bully pulpit of his column, he was able to take on the developers and city officials who built substandard housing and kept Black citizens relegated to areas islanded from economic, educational, and social opportunity. He was a vocal proponent of desegregated public schools before the Supreme Court even issued the Brown versus the Board of Education decision in 1954. And strangely, even back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, he was advocating for good urban design as a matter of social justice. And it was his editorial that convinced the owner of the 500 plus upland acres at the tip of Key Biscayne to sell it for a public park. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. As someone who worked in park planning and natural resource conservation in South Florida for more than 16 years, I often found myself gravitating toward the words of Bill Baggs and his admonitions from 60 plus years ago that decisions made then would determine the kind of community Miami would be today. And it's an ongoing struggle as fewer and fewer natural spaces exist to ennoble Miami-Dade's residents. This is a fight one of our guests this evening knows all too well. Dr. Gregory Bush, who Christina spoke of, is a retired professor of history from the University of Miami, but he served as president and vice president of the Urban Environment League and also as chair of the Virginia Key Advisory Board. And for more than 16 years, he was a fierce advocate for parks and public spaces in Miami-Dade. His book, White Sand, Black Beach, right here, chronicled the struggle Miami's Black citizens endured just to have access to public beaches. And there were often times when I would read or hear something Greg had spoken and would say, okay, I remember those words from Bill Baggs, or I remember reading those words. He founded the nonprofit Nature Links for Lifelong Learning, which empowers young adults with intellectual abilities. And he's joining us again tonight from Maine. Also joining us is someone who knew Bill Baggs, not as editor, but as Pop. Craig was born and raised in Miami by two Georgia peaches. His father hailed from Atlanta and Colquitt, Georgia, and his mother from Athens. He attended his first national convention at 6, and he had a bit of a pen pal relationship with then Vice President Richard Nixon, much to the playful chagrin of his progressive father. And he enjoyed an eventful trip to the White House, but I'll let him tell you those stories. He and his darling wife, Mary, have lived in Ocala for more than 25 years, where they have raised their 3 children, Savannah, Trevor, and Annie. I'm so delighted to be sitting here and talking with both of y'all this evening and bringing Bill's story. We hope our discussion will give you out there a sense of who this man was and his place in history. But what struck me most as I researched and wrote this book was how often I felt as if I could pluck one of Bill's columns from 1955 or 1962, maybe change a name here and there, and it would be just as relevant to the conversation I was having at that moment, whether that column centered on housing or education or social justice. But the way Bill wrote about how we always needed to think about the world we were going to leave our children truly hit me in all the work that I do. And so I did not want his story to go untold. So Greg, I'd like to start by reading a line or two from page 14 of your book, and then ask you to give us a little bit of perspective on the long fight for public spaces in Miami. You wrote, when public spaces are connected to the past through recording oral histories, creating video documentaries, and other forms of direct personal involvement, the lost sense of identification with place can stimulate a more profound connection to the built and natural environment. As Wallace Stegner observed, we don't know who we are until we know where we are. I think that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, was trying to understand where we are. So Greg, I turn it over to you.
Well, let me just make a few informal comments about Biscayne Bay and the environment and whatnot. First of all, since its very early days, it's been a jurisdictional morass, I think is a way to put it. You have different local governments fighting over different access and different attempts to develop parts of Virginia Key, Miami Beach, and then all down along the coast in Miami. The other thing to really understand is that, and following from this, is the real poor planning overall that just wasn't there through certainly the 20s, 30s, up through the 70s, 80s. It became better in time, but it, as most of you in Miami certainly know, one of the reasons I left was that developers took over, and developers developed almost all of the land and had all sorts of plans for all of the unused quote unquote spaces, including Virginia Key, Key Biscayne and whatnot. And so it became a series of struggles over the years, and it took many different forms. One of the most important things to keep in mind is that from the earliest days, it was segregated, or better way to put it, African Americans could not legally go and swim in Biscayne Bay. They did, they snuck in here and there, many drowned in different respects, but that struggle really came to a head in May of 1945 with the first post-war civil rights demonstration that took place at Hallover Beach, led by Lawson Thomas, who eventually became a judge. And it was very small protest, but it basically got the attention of Charles Crandon, who was basically head of the county commission, and Virginia Key Beach for Coloreds was established by August of 1945. That was only one of so many different struggles over many, many years that I tried to write about, but that others have been involved in for over many, many years. There were issues of pollution, where Philip Wiley was writing about, that you, I think, reference also in the book, that eventuated in the wastewater treatment plan in 1957, if I recall. So Virginia Key in many ways became kind of a quote unquote dumping ground in Dixie, almost as a term, with all sorts of a hodgepodge of land uses. Eventually, as a lot of you probably know, Marine Stadium was put there, a couple of restaurants, the University of Miami, but it really just was not well governed. So eventually there was a huge dump in the middle of the island where, from what I heard, some kind of tractor trailer was lost in there. They never found it again. It was just such a cesspool, if you will, of stuff. And that also, in a different way, related to Key Biscayne, where there were bigger chunks of land. The Matheson family owned a big chunk that they donated. And then there was struggle that others can talk about in one sense, about other pieces of land that eventually became Cape Florida Lighthouse. But Bill Baggs in particular was interested in historic preservation. I think his real focus was saving Cape Florida Lighthouse, and he understood the historic significance of it. But then he also saw that people needed public spaces. People needed to be able to go to the sea And if people don't stand up and create coalitions back then, and I think it still holds today, the land's going to be taken away because people get cynical. People think that the fix is on the part of developers, lawyers, promoters, etc., and they so often win. And a lot of administrators, frankly, are not as dedicated as I think they should be. So it really takes citizens getting together and sticking to it. Well, which is one thing that one of the key characters I should mention too is Dan Paul, who a lot of people know, who was a lone wolf but an incredibly effective advocate for public space in downtown Miami in particular. And by the 1990s, a number of us came to see that you needed an organization to be able to try to do a lot that Dan had done for so long, and that's why we created the Urban Environment League. And so the pressures that a lot of us were involved in were myriad over the next number of years, from the Miami Circle to Bicentennial Park and other things. But also the southern part of the county was the focus of all sorts of attempts by different developers to create. One thing was called Seedade in basically by Palmetto Bay, I think it is now, that area. And that failed ultimately because a group of citizens, including Bill Baggs and others, got together and learned how to lobby. And so lobbying the Miami Herald, the Miami News, different local commissions, creating, if you will, their own local propaganda, was very effective in eventually killing it. But it took a lot of people, a lot of hours, like almost like a religious cause, to be able to make that change. Eventually that became, of course, Biscayne National Monument and then Biscayne National Park under President Johnson's signature. But Herbert Hoover was involved, Herbert Hoover Jr., as well as Dante Fascell and Bill Baggs and a number of others. So again, it's coalition building. Maybe that's enough for now. I don't want to dominate here.
You mentioned so much about going on with Virginia Key and all of the different uses. I think at the time that, Bill, in 1955 is when Bill really started fighting for the preservation of the Key Biscayne Lighthouse. And he was known for, and Craig, you may want to speak to this at some point, but he was known for telling the story of the lighthouse to all the kids who would come to the newspaper. But it was a really special place for him personally because that's where he would go walk. And Craig, he would take you out fishing. And that was one of his special spots because you could walk there. So why don't you tell a little bit about the experiences you had with that space and why that became so important to him?
Well, I loved it. We would go fishing, and one of the things that I enjoyed doing most when I was a kid was going fishing with my dad. And there was a point right by the lighthouse, just past the rocks, overlooking, I guess it was Stiltsville. And we would drop our lines down, and it was inevitable that we're going to catch at least a 1-pound mangrove snapper, and we could go ahead and have that for dinner. So, but it was a sacred place for my father. And later I would end up walking there with a lot of people like Ralph McGill, but
who was your godfather?
Who was my godfather? Yes.
The publisher of the Atlanta Journal.
Right. That's where I happened to run into Richard Nixon. Just walking down the beach.
Who lived there?
Yes.
Yeah.
He wasn't too happy when I saw him, though. That was in 1962 after he lost the election against Kennedy. So
he must have had a lot on his mind.
Yeah.
One of the things too, I found, I wanted to read this little bit from the story about how he started making the case, because you talk, Greg, about coalition building, and you also talk, Craig, about how to make it personal. Most of his writing was very personal in a lot of ways. And when he knew that there were a couple of efforts by northern developers to actually buy that property, and they had these really fantastical plans drawn up of a tennis community with condos and vacation homes, and some of them did not have the lighthouse in it, and some of them did. But it became bigger for him because I think he saw the writing on the wall that saving history was not a high watermark for Miami. And so he actually wrote an open letter in his front page column in the Miami News to the owner of the property, Mrs. Elena Garcia. And what he did, and I can't imagine that he wasn't thinking of you, Craig, when he wrote this, where he said the public, especially the children, should have that land and long and sloping beaches, the old lighthouse, which is one of the few remnants of our history, their trails which wander beneath the palms. And then he was pretty savvy because he goes, this is a business proposition. He wrote, appealing both to her heart and her pocketbook. He was practical. But he said, but if you sell to the people, children, all the children, long after we are gone from this world, will have the freedom of that beach and the sights of the unspoiled subtropics. That idea maybe puts a little humanity into this business still. Mm-hmm. And 4 days later, she responded. Mm-hmm. And she said, yes, please publish my letter. Mm-hmm. And I mean, Greg, one of the questions I have for you is how instrumental is having a public advocate from someone who has a platform, like a newspaper column? How important is that, and was that, to making some of these efforts work? I know when I worked on the 1996 Safe Neighborhood Parks Bond, how absolutely incredible it was when Carl Hyson wrote a column the Sunday before the vote that pushed for it. So I can only imagine how critical it was to have respected newspaper people and journalists advocating. But did you find that kind of fell off at a point?
I did, yeah.
You did?
By the time I got significantly involved, I guess, in the 1990s, I found, to be honest, that the leading newspaper in the town, maybe go unnamed here, didn't send enough reporters out to do enough interesting and provocative stories. So we had to use all sorts of other methods. Jim Mullen of the Miami New Times, for example, mm-hmm. was an incredibly important ally in kind of piquing the Herald, if you will, and getting attention to the issue with front page stories on the issues of, segregated beach and what happened to it, and the fact that African Americans were standing up and demanding that the park not go away, but that be resuscitated, if you will. And so, you had to use all sorts of different media to get to the Herald and get to TV news. But I would say it was more difficult. There was a real loss in Miami, I think, after the Miami News went away.
Mm-hmm. And that was in 1988. I think, yeah, 88, December 31st, 1988, yes.
Okay. The big loss as far as I'm concerned, because then, of course, the Herald started, I think, losing a lot of their reporters, their local reporters. So it's a shell of what it used to be, and it's really a great shame as far as I'm concerned, because local press was so vital in the 1930s up through in many ways, the 60s, and Bill Baggs was an important aspect of that.
Well, you mentioned Islandia earlier, or the concept of the Cross Bay Bridge. Right. I remember thinking that when I was working on the Biscayne Bay Access Plan, I always wanted to do a map of all the schemes of what Biscayne Bay would have looked like had everything come to fruition, because it would have been a pond. It truly would have been a pond in the middle of all of this development with all of these highways. Can you describe a little bit about what Islandia was? Because it was Lloyd Miller, who, with the Isaac Walton League, who I think passed away just last year at age 100.
Right.
Lloyd Miller came to Bill and said, I really want to talk to you about this and see if you will write about it. And then so Bill kind of did his research and started pushing against it. So
Right.
can you describe a little bit of what Islandia was and sort of that coalition that formed around it?
Islandia had very few people on it. It was kind of a bogus city that was incorporated by a guy named Luther Brooks, who was a real estate, actually a slumlord for African American areas of Miami. But he was a very slippery, very sharp guy. And he also promoted Islandia, and then I think worked relatively closely with Daniel Ludwig, who was trying to get this huge oil refinery called Sea going there too. So there were all these very ambitious plans that seemed to be going like a steamroller through in the early 1960s, until citizens just started standing up and objecting and starting to be, creating little pamphlets that they got around, speaking to different groups. So it really took some, important activism that broke through the prevailing cynicism. And we found that, I think, with the Urban Environment League in the late 1990s as well. It was just such public cynicism about being able to do anything against the juggernaut of, developers, lawyers, et cetera, and the press in many ways that was not adequately covering some of these issues. That you just had to find all sorts of allies and work it like a real job. Let's put it that way. And I was teaching full time too, and it got in some trouble, as I think I mentioned before, about my advocacy. That it was taking much too much time, and I should just be objective, involving teaching history.
Which is the same criticism that gets leveled at journalists,
Right.
that they shouldn't be taking positions on anything. But Bill, of course, wrote editorials because he was in an editorial, not a reporting position. One thing that kind of strikes me too there is one thing that Bill could do that maybe helped these coalitions gain strength was I was shocked by how far and wide his influence went. And Craig, I'd like you to speak to this because you actually got to go on a trip to the White House with him.
Sure.
And I mean, it's amazing what kind of access he had. And he would maybe be up there for the American Society of a Newspaper editor meeting, but he would take that opportunity to go on the cocktail circuit around Washington, D.C. and make the case for he would meet with the Interior Secretary Stuart Udall and say, hey, we need to stop this, or we need money for Biscayne National Park, or we need you to match money for the state and the county to save Key Biscayne. And Craig, you got an image of that when you went with him.
Well, it was very important in our family. My father started a tradition, and he wanted all the boys to go ahead and learn about government, the different branches of government. And each of us were at an early age, 11, 12 years old, we were supposed to go to Washington. We were supposed to see the White House and see the historic sites. So I went up, and my dad had to, I believe, make a speech in Michigan. So I stayed at Sander Van Oker's house.
The NBC reporter.
Yes, yeah. And we were very good friends with Sandy. And unbeknown to me, his son, Nicky, had the flu. And he had just gotten over the flu bug, but he was contagious. We know how all that is these days, right? Anyway. All too well, yeah. So anyway, it didn't affect me right off the bat. So the next day, my dad picked me up. We went to the White House, and we went through the rooms. We met a lot of people, and there was time to go into the Oval Office. So we went into the Oval Office. I met Evelyn Lincoln, a beautiful woman. She was the secretary for John F. Kennedy and also LBJ. So after I met her, I went into the Oval Office, sort of sniffed the air, looked around. I was an 11-year-old kid, walked right over to the desk of the president and stood there in awe. And at that point, Justice Earl Warren came in, and I had a chance to meet the Supreme Court Justice as well. My father introduced him. I was always amazed how my father just knew everybody. He was so well connected. So President Johnson at that time was out, so they slipped me in, and then I was out in about 5 minutes. And then I walked down the hall, and we went to see Ralph Duncan, who was, I believe, a special assistant to the president. And then my dad also had a special treat for me. The Beatles were down at the other end of the White House. And after I left that room, I was going to be able to go meet the Beatles, which would have scored some major points for me for this young lady who I had sort of a crush on in 5th grade. But I never made it, because while I was in Mr. Duncan's office, all of a sudden I got sick, and he had just put down a new red shag carpet. And I threw up all over it.
That was the last time he allowed any kids into his office. Probably.
Well, and I was in the White House and I was out of the White House pretty quickly. But the joke around the White House after that for a week was, this is what Bag's kid thinks of politics.
But your dad had such an uncanny ability to, going back to something Greg said, about these building coalitions, he was able to bring people together that may not agree. Mm-hmm. And bring them together on common purpose, like the Cape Florida.
Yep.
Like he did a lot of work with the Florida Constitution Revision Commission, and he had to serve with right next to somebody that he was responsible for swaying votes away from. In the 1955 gubernatorial election, Senator Charlie Johns. People actually, the newspapers
he was put
run
there purposely.
Yes, to see if they could work together. But that ability to sort of cross the aisle is the way that people speak about it these days. Mm-hmm. But he was able to bring people along, but he had this uncanny way of stamping a postcard and sending it out that said, "This is not a simple life, my friend, and there are no simple answers to all the people who disagreed with him." And I think that's such a key and important thing, attribute to have, and we sort of sorely see that missing right now. One thing he was very fond of saying, and I've heard you say this too, Greg, that the people of this community could accomplish anything if they could just stop worrying about who got the credit. Mm. He used to write that because he would talk about, we need to be thinking about 20 years from now, like what city our community is going to inherit. And I think I'm going back to that quote you had that I read from your book about the Wallace Stegner, about like where we are. Being able to, how do we go anywhere if we don't know where we are? Can you speak to that? Like, where are we? And like, what kind of coalitions do we need to be building now?
Well, let me just take a step back. For your earlier point, I learned the same lesson about trying not to take credit from Arva Parks, who told me that. Years ago. You can get a lot more done if you don't try to get credit for it. You work behind the scenes a lot more. And I think that's true. Same thing with building coalitions. It's really time consuming talk through a lot of issues with different people, but I think that there's no way around that. That's something, to be honest, and I don't like to get all that political and something like this, but I think Joe Biden is good at that, to be honest. And I think we need to knit that together in our culture, in a number of different ways, but in particular in relation to public spaces, public parks, and historic preservation. I mean, public space advocates, and a lot of my work, it would be Sierra Club and others, but then there were historic preservationists like, it turned out, Athley Range, Gene Kinney, and many others. And to be able to bring those different kinds of forces together was critically important. And that, I'm not saying it was just me, but there are a lot of other people doing it. Surfers and Virginia Key, as you may well remember, big, broad, coalition that you had to build. And what I guess we were able to do fairly effectively is to use historic preservation, and particularly in relation to the African American community, to save the environment. So in other words, I remember a couple of meetings that I went to where Sierra Club people were standing up screaming for Virginia Key, to preserve Virginia Key Beach. And it wasn't going anywhere to the city commission, but bringing up the issue of race and saying this was an historic place for the African American community. That's what ultimately won the day. And then that coalition had to be led by African Americans, which it was. So it's just kind of knowing when to push an envelope and then step back and things like that too.
Or to find what are the common purposes.
Right.
Craig, I wanted to ask you about, specifically one of the things that your father was really good at doing was sort of being able to bridge those differences. I mean, in the neighborhood that you lived in while he's writing and fighting seed aid, your neighbor, the people who bought your house when y'all moved around the corner, was on the board and was a huge proponent of seed aid. And y'all had these famous cocktail parties in the courtwards.
Life was
in the French
good
Village.
back then, We had these great cocktail parties
that all the kids could come to. Which
and it was all about hors d'oeuvres and cocktails, and then everybody went home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, how were y'all able to, when that was, I mean, he had sent a reporter all across the country,
right,
to write about the degradation that happened with oil refineries in the communities and what happened to the surrounding land uses, and used that data to fight the PR releases that were coming, the press releases that were coming out of the oil refinery about all the things that it would do to invest in the community. But we have Biscayne National Monument and the Biscayne National Park, which it became because of his fight against seed aid in the newspaper. But that was a big hit to one of your neighbors and one of your good childhood friends.
True. And again, just right off of that, he would build that articulated argument. He would back it up by facts. But he would present both sides. But what you're referring to is our neighbor, Mrs. Allen, who was on the board of Belcher Oil. And Belcher Oil was the largest partner with seed aid. And as you know, I lived in the French Village, and neighbors are neighbors. So we would have these cocktail parties, and my brother Mahoney and I were
who's
friends.
On the board of the Friends of Biscayne, of Bill Baggs. Yeah,
correct. And Mahoney was very, very close friends with Charles Allen. So my dad had to be very careful how he presented things, and he was able to speak very cordially and about a lot of different subjects. And I guess after a good hors d'oeuvre or two and the gin and tonic, it really didn't matter anyway, But he presented several positions to Mrs. Allen. And I think it brought her around. but it was a clear case, and he didn't want to upset that relationship that was so close with my brother and Charles, because we believed back then neighbors were neighbors, and we all lived, we all had to coexist, and you may have your opinion, I may have mine, but we needed to respect each other's.
That's gosh, that's a message we all need to get today,
Yes.
don't we?
Yeah, sure do.
Greg, I wanted to mention something. You had brought up Philip Wiley earlier, who was a fairly famous. He wrote for the Saturday Evening Post. He he basically put the sport of game fishing on the map in South Florida, and he was a huge environmental proponent when people weren't called environmentalists in the 1940s. And his advice to Bill, when Bill became columnist, because Phil Wiley was going off into doing other projects, and Bill was kind of ascending, Bill thought he was going to be a humor columnist at first, and was going to be able to give sort of a humorous take on things that were happening in the community. But he kept gravitating toward more serious topics. And one of the pieces of advice that Phil Wiley gave him was that you don't have to give people sweetness and light before you give them the meat and the tough conversation. And that's when I think that you can actually see a very distinct change in Bill's writing at that point. And then Ralph McGill, who was at the Atlanta Constitution, who became such a brother to Bill, said you need to be taking on these bigger local issues that have big national significance. And I think those two pieces of advice transformed him from a rather moderate and humorous writer into someone who was willing to be an activist, and in a way that sort of defied what journalists were. He didn't have that veil of objectivity that tried to create equivalencies. He often found that there were not every argument had equal opposites, and wouldn't create those false equivalencies that we often see today journalists make.
Yeah, I want to just add one other thing that kind of follows that a little bit, and that is the importance not just of coalition building, but of going to meetings at very low levels, let's say at the city and the county. In other words, go bird dogging a lot of these things, because that's where you learn, but that's where you build the coalition. That's where you get respected too by politicians, because early on in what I did with a lot of others, that we just at first would just be so ticked off at politicians and their lack of attention to the issues, whatever it is. But you got to work with them, and I think we all learned not to be negative against them, to try to go in, see them, talk, go to these very low level meetings and gain some degree of respect. And that's critically important. And I personally think maybe it's my prejudice against some younger people. They don't have patience for that these days. And I think that's something I learned in spades. And that's one of the ways you make an impact, unless you're Bill Baggs, where you have a much bigger platform.
Yeah, but he was a street editor. He went to those meetings. He went to community meetings. And he took the time to get to know who, he often would talk to people on the margins rather than the politicians or the decision makers, because he really wanted to know how people's lives were affected. But he had no qualms then taking what he learned and writing letters, or even calling the people at the national level, people at the state level. I even think about how the park, Cape Florida State Park, became named for Bill, is because there was this relationship built with Reuben Askew when he wasn't governor. He was on a committee with Bill. And so those kind of relationships, he made relationships with people when they were on their way up, so that he would have never knowing where they were going to end up. Whether you were serving on a citizen serving on a committee who eventually ran for office. And then, you know, you were in a position, he could get that door open. I mean, you heard that in practice, didn't you? With ultimately Governor Reuben Askew, correct, Craig?
That's correct. And, you know, just adding to that point, as he was working with these people along the way on these committees and everything, he also had an opportunity to sort of sum them up and find out what their qualities and skills were. And with Reuben Askew, a very straightforward, teetotaling gentleman from Escambia County.
Yeah, it wasn't like they had cocktails together.
No. No, he didn't. I think iced tea was about as strong as he drank. But he saw tremendous promise and integrity, a lot of the qualities and strength. He also saw a commitment toward the future of Florida. And as you know, one of the key qualities about my father is he always believed that each generation had a responsibility to leave the world a little better for the next generation. And the people out there in Biscayne and Key Biscayne and elsewhere who've just come to the park or who will go to the park in the future, a lot of why Key Biscayne why it is now in that area in South Florida is because of my father. But when he met Reuben Askew, he saw qualities that were outstanding. And when I ran into Reuben Askew when I was finishing up at FSU, I just happened to bump into him on Monroe Street outside the Governor's Club. I said, because I had met him in 1974 when they renamed the park after my dad. I said, "Hello, Governor, I just wanted to come and say hello. And do you remember who I am?" And then I introduced myself, and he says, "Oh yeah, Bill Baggs. Bill Baggs was the reason why I ran for governor. He talked me into running for governor, and I'm glad he did." So I think a lot of that working with committees and working with people, he had an opportunity to really size them up and get a feel for them and see how they would do later down the road. So there was this constant plan. He would look, a lot of people would say that he was a liberal. He wasn't. He was a progressive because he would look 20, 30 years into the future.
Yeah.
And that's where he was headed.
I always think he had this one final column, and I think it'll probably be time for us to take questions at that point. He had his final column, the final one that was published during his lifetime, and it was on December 27th, 1968, called for a redesign of downtown. And because there was this effort to put a convention center in Bayfront Park, right on, like where the American Airlines Arena is now, I think, where there was this effort to basically get it all developed. And he goes, okay, if you're going to do that, then redesign the entire downtown and design and redevelop it entirely from Overtown all the way through to the bay, and create boulevards and create parks and plant lots of trees. He had this one part where he said, "We have not learned to plan our cities. We have not learned to live in them, and they are rotting in their hearts." So say a large city such as Miami can actually rebuild its downtown, creating a kind of urban tranquility in its tastes and designs of the buildings. It's establishing areas for play for children, not skimping on trees and grass, and making boulevards. This could become the example. You could prove something by doing it. And he saw it, and he finishes up that column by equating, you would actually enliven the people who've been long ignored in Overtown, who've been cut off by the highway system, who have never had parks. who have never had green spaces, and you bring them back into the fabric of community. And when you do that, you end up diminishing the long-held resentments and that despair that builds up. And there was a lot of effort after his death to make that happen, even the idea of floating a bond referendum to make it happen. And I'm not sure, I tried to do research to find out where it actually all fell apart and why it didn't happen. I think the bonds didn't get approved. But I keep thinking he was looking ahead. He was a futurist. Mm-hmm. Even more than a progressive, I think he was a futurist.
Well, that's also what we attempted to do, as you may remember, in Bicentennial Park. We had
right.
this committee wanted to connect with Overtown and whatnot. Continuous base, reinvent a lot of things almost every generation as a new idea.
Right. And here he had that, and there were plans like Mitchell Wolfson had been a huge proponent of it and put it out there. People were writing about it for the next several months, and there was a lot of energy around it. And I'm always just like, if that had happened, how would Miami be transformed today? The gift of Bill would have been even far larger, and then not in any way to diminish Bill Baggs' Cape Florida State Park. That's an amazing gift. But having that ability to see the future and fight for it and find, had he lived, he died less than 2 weeks after that. Had he lived, I think it would have happened, because he would have built that coalition that was so necessary to make it happen. I guess now we need to turn it back to Christina to do questions, because if there's anybody out there who...
Hi.
So
let's remind everyone that's watching that they can ask their questions now. I think it's been a fascinating conversation. So why don't you please post some questions for our guests? We've got one here for Amy. In writing this book, what one thing stands out over your other writings?
About in comparison to other types of writing I do?
I would imagine it just says, what one thing stands out over other writings, your other writings?
Well, it's sort of a strange leap to go from cookbooks to biographies, but let me just say that the idea of writing this biography came in this former life I had as a park planner. As I kept learning about him, I mean, like, this was a 13-year effort to tell this story, and I would have to parcel out my time in between jobs and to read his papers and do interviews with wonderful people like his widow Freck Baggs and Howard Kleinberg and other people who knew him, and then it led me to Mahoney and Craig. So it was a long effort, but I think when I've always been interested in food, and I come from a long tradition of food, so I think writing the cookbooks actually gave me great proving ground in research and in sort of memoiric type writing, so that my approach to writing the biography for Bill was very much rooted in, had he lived to tell his memoir, how would he tell it? He would tell it as a witness, because he was never one to, even though he may have been working behind the scenes, he was very much someone who other people needed to be out front. He would be behind the scenes, working the mechanisms to get things happen. So I always saw him as somebody who was entering a scene and witnessing it and telling about it. And so that's the way I approach this kind of writing. Having a journalism background definitely helped me sort of understand his language and his approach, because, and also strangely enough, all my time in college as an undergrad, I did all of these studies on the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Cold War politics, and And so when I got to Miami and I heard about this editor who was kind of embroiled in all that, I was just like, oh my gosh, this is someone I could have talked to. And when I found out he had died in 1969, I was kind of like bereft. I was sad. I was like, oh, I would have loved to have talked to him. And then by chance sat by his wife, his wife in a creative writing class. I mean, there's so many weird.
It was fate.
Yeah. I mean, whether you're a believer or not, there were many times during this process that there felt like there was a larger hand saying, here, take this and do something with it, please.
Well, thank you for doing it.
My pleasure.
So can you explain how you came up with the title of the book? That's a good one.
Yes. So when I first met Freck, she handed me this book that had all these clippings in it that Howard Kleinberg and Miss Mert, his secretary, and other people on staff had pulled together that had multiple articles about Bill. And this one article by John Kiesler, who was the humor writer for the Miami News, really talented writer. And he wrote this beautiful, beautiful moving piece. And tucked in one of the paragraphs was that Miss Mert would often embroider sayings that Bill would come back with, and he would hang those on his wall. And she had embroidered, "A nervous man shouldn't be here in the first place," and it hung on his office wall. And evidently, it was something that Senator J. William Fulbright from Arkansas had said in passing in a meeting, and he loved it so much. But as soon as I came across that, even before I even thought about writing a book, I saw it was like, oh, that'd be a great title for a book. Just immediately that hit me. And then, so when I was working on this was always the working title. And I thought, oh, it might be a little too long. But the publisher, UGA Press, was like, no, that makes us want to read it. And I was like, okay, good. We'll stick with it. So that's where it came from Miss Mert and J. William Fulbright.
So for Craig,
yes.
Can you share a story that would kind of, I don't know, give like for you, what is like the essence of your dad?
Sure. Well, I would say, let's see. I would say one of the things that my dad would do is he would take very complicated scenarios. They could be political situations. They could be issues in the Middle East. But he was able to break things down into very simple terms. And he would show and explain to me really what it all boiled down to. And he would help me to be able to understand what was really at stake. And what it really got down to was that there had to be justice, equality, and fairness for all. That's really what he stood for. And once that was achieved, and once everybody had a win-win ability, you got something, they got something, then it was a successful negotiation. But I would be reading, I tell you, it was quite lively growing up in my house. There was never a dull moment at that dinner table. The discussions that we would have covering all the events in world politics, I mean, it was something. But I just think truly what I learned very early was that there was a right and a wrong way to do things, and you had the respect and the integrity if you did the right thing.
Thank you. Thank
Okay.
you. So here's another one for Amy. Amy, what was your biggest challenge in researching Bill Bagg's life and work?
Trying to figure out how what were the things in his childhood that helped shape him to become the man that he became? Because he did not write about himself a lot or talk about himself a lot. And in, I think it was 2015 or 2016, I actually traveled to Colquitt, Georgia, which is the town he grew up in. I knew I had found one story about his father, C.C. Baggs, and it had a little bit of information in it about where he came from. And it was when his father passed away just 3 weeks after Bill was born. But I didn't know much. And this goes again to fate. A friend named Melanie Ash and I drove over to Colquitt, Georgia. I went into the city without anything. We weren't even sure like if the house he grew up in was still there. So we started at the newspaper. We walked into the Miller County Liberal. And I said, where are your archives? I'd love to look through your archives because your newspaper's been around for over 100 years. And they're like, we lost our entire archives in a fire in the 1970s. And I was crestfallen. I was like, oh my gosh, where am I going to even start? And this older man who I came to learn was a man named Terry Toole stood up in the very back. He's the editor and publisher. And he goes, there's some books that survived the fire and they're over in City Hall. They're on top of a shelf. I don't even know what years they are. So we go over there, we climb to the top of these shelves, pull these things down. And if they weren't the years that Bill lived there, and we found articles he wrote as a student. We found stories about him becoming valedictorian. We found his entire family tree because his older sister's wedding announcement was in there. Like all of a sudden this world opened up. And so I placed an ad in the Miller County Liberal asking if anybody had known him because they would have been in their 90s at this point. And I got this wonderful letter from an elderly woman who wrote and said, I knew him. I was a few years behind him in elementary school. And did you know that he started a newspaper as soon as he came to our school? And all of a sudden she started talking about him, and she had a clipping from when he was 14 years old in a Methodist Bible study class. And then I got a picture from another gentleman, a man named Harold Moore, who had the football team from 1940-41 with Bill standing in the center with the football. And they were a 6-man football team and they won this championship that year. So all of a sudden people started writing me and telling me things about his childhood so that I could construct and understand how he was kind of like what Malcolm Gladwell calls the eminent orphan, someone who's lost everything, who sort of has no fear. Mm-hmm. Because they've already lost everything. So that was the toughest part, but just by making that one trip, it opened up an entire universe of who he was as this child and who he became.
So here's one for Craig. This is a fun one. Did you ever answer the phone designated as the hotline to the president? And if so, what did you say?
I got set up.
Who knows the story?
You had a secret way to escape the house in case of a bomb threat.
Well, we did have a secret door in our house, and it went right through our studies. The books were nailed to the bookcase as if, they were there, but there was a door cut into the bookcase, and you could open it and go right into the garage. And there was
your very own bat cave.
yeah, it was.
Very James Bond.
But oh yeah, absolutely. But in answer to your first question, yeah, I picked up the phone one time, and the other person on the line was John F. Kennedy. He said, "Hello, Craig." I went,
Oh my gosh.
but
Oh, so fun.
that was the world that I was in. My dad was being sought after by so many people because of his knowledge and understanding of not only very complicated issues such as Latin American politics, what was happening in Cuba at the time, which was really the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Mhm.
He was very much a focal point to giving information back to the JFK and that group there. But one of the things that I just pass on is that my dad was a very busy man, but he was always there for me. But his way of spending time with me also was to keeping me by his side and opening doors for me, like whether it was going into the White House, or whether it was picking up a phone and talking to John Kennedy, whether it was introducing to be someone on a fishing boat. That was his style. At the same time, teaching me really what was about, what the benefit was about equality and fairness for all.
Mhm.
Because, see, his whole thing today is what we need to be paying attention to, is that we seem to be so divided as a country, as a neighborhood. But in reality, what and Greg touched upon this, is that what we're experiencing today is what we're experiencing back then. So his whole argument is, hey, we need to coexist. We all live on one planet. We need to be able to understand each other, understand each other's position, but we need to work together to move forward. And I think there are a lot of lessons that you'll find reading this book. And I just want to thank Amy so much for not letting this story go. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. It really is. There's so much here.
Well, I think that is the perfect note for us to end on, to remind people that, please order the book, read it. This was just a taste of everything that you are going to learn about Bill Baggs. And we thank you all for being here tonight with us.
Thank you so much for hosting and having us.
Oh my God, it sounds like...
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. And it sounds like he was a person who burned so bright, but for too short a period of time. Mm-hmm. But if we can take those lessons and that legacy and apply it now, we're very fortunate. So thank you to everyone out there watching.
Bye, everybody.
In Key Biscayne or wherever.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Craig. This has been a joyful conversation.
And this has been wonderful. And on behalf of Books and Books, Miami Book Fair, we thank you for joining us. We hope you stay safe. We hope to see you in person someday soon. So with that, we'll say good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.